Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the study of environmental and social risk assessment and management consultations of the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. It's nice to see so many new as well as returning colleagues joining and showing interest in the environmental and social risk assessment consultations. My name is Azim Manji and I'm your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 11th thematic consultation topic or theme so far, and this is the fourth in a series of consultations and discussions on environmental and social risk assessment. In today's consultation, we're joined not only by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the Asian Development Bank, but also by Ryder Kvam and also Charles DeLeva, both of whom are internationally recognized specialists in this area. Other experts, including Zara Abbas, Felix Oku, and Madhu Gupta are also here and joining in the consultation, and will be presenting materials and engaging with you for the discussion, as well as responding to feedback. For this fourth session on the environmental and social risk assessment with CSOs in North America and Europe, which includes the UK, we have 64 participants registered as of about 30 minutes ago, and we expect this number to increase slightly over the course of the consultation. 48 of you are from outside the ADB network, which is good and encouraging. And most of you joining today have also been participants in previous thematic consultations. The US Treasury has 3 reps in this session, and we're also happy to see NYU here as well. There is one advanced question, and we've got 42 members from North America and the EU and 6 from other regions. As I mentioned in this consultation, Mr. Ryder Kvam will present the main summary issues related to the study he has co-authored on environmental and social risk assessment and the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like yourselves will share your insights on the potential gaps of the provision and implementation of the 2009 policy, and also propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming or future revised policy. Comments received from this consultation and hereafter will inform the revision of ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle reminders. As you've seen when you joined, all stakeholders and participants have consented to the recording of this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It's the intention that these recordings will be available to the ADB staff and consultants, and then of course more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box now. We ask that you join from a quiet, distraction-free area with your microphone and video turned off when you're not speaking and when others are speaking. And during the Q&A, you may be free to ask questions when invited to do so by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand in the Zoom function. You will then be asked by Felix to unmute yourself and turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. Please be respectful to other colleagues who may have different points of view here. And in order to manage your time, our time, and to keep within the schedule, Felix and I will ensure that we have reasonable guidelines on the Q&A and the speakers presenting. IT support is always provided. If you experience a difficulty or have a query about the support, or you need technical support, please enter your query by typing your issue into the chat box at the bottom of the screen. As we're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name in Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. On the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, and then click on the Rename button. Here you can type in your name, the agency, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, you can click on the chat button and do so at any point during this consultation. If you wish to comment or raise a question live, click on the smile icon or the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and then click on the raise hand emoji. When invited to do so, unmute yourself and clicking on the microphone icon, and then to show your video, click on the video icon. The ADB values diverse and informed feedback from a wide range of stakeholders like those of you assembled here today. So let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. And I won't go through each of these, but ask you to take note of them, please. And just another reminder that these sessions are being recorded and documented and will subsequently be distributed during and for each consultation event. As I said, this allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. Should you wish to opt out of the recording and/or distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen in the chat box. If you have any issues or concerns on the recording, the confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination, or any of the issues noted on the slides, the preceding two slides that you've seen, please get in touch with the Secretariat through the email address that's flashed in the chat box. In this consultation, we have about 2 hours, but there's some flexibility in that. Here's what we have planned to maximize your time as well as ours. First of all, Bruce Dunn, a director within SDCC, will provide welcome remarks. Secondly, we have Mr. Ryder Pham, who will share the main issues and findings of the nature and context of the study on environmental and social risk assessment as related to the revision of the safeguards policy statement and its forthcoming revision and update specifically. And after the first presentation by Ryder, we will have a brief 5-minute break. And when we resume, we'll be joined by our third presentation, facilitated and delivered by Ms. Zara Abbas, a principal environment specialist within the Safeguards Division in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB, who will frame the discussion and set the context for the Q&A session on the environmental and social risk assessment study. And the Q&A session will run for about 70 minutes. Again, as I mentioned, there is some flexibility in that. You may ask questions and share experiences through typing them into the chat box or through raising your hand as previously explained using the Zoom functions. Mr. Felix Oku will prompt us with guide questions to frame this conversation, and then we'll have a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following the consultation. As such, and without further ado, I'd like to call on Director Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and setting the context. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Great, thank you very much, Azim, for that opening, and good day, welcome, and thank you so much for all of you joining this session today. We're here for a consultation session for ADB's Safeguard Policy Update, and today, as you've heard, we're going to be focusing in on environmental and social impact and risk assessment. As Azim mentioned, this is the 11th thematic consultation topic. We've covered a lot of ground actually already. We started in November when we did a first consultation discussing the sort of preliminary approach to ADB's proposed new policy, safeguard policy architecture. We've then run through a series of consultations on a range of environmental topics, such as biodiversity, pollution control, health and safety, cultural heritage. We've also had social topics such as on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. We've covered Indigenous peoples safeguards. We've looked at stakeholder engagement and consultation processes. We also recently had a session on lessons learned from our independent accountability mechanism. So through these sessions, and each one of them has been supported by a short background analytical paper, we're starting to get a perspective on our existing safeguard policy, how that's being implemented, as well as emerging practice, looking at experiences and policy architectures from other multilateral financial institutions. And then, of course, we've been engaging with stakeholders on your own views and getting recommendations on some of the directions that ADB should take. So today's consultation is another part of that. Looking at the environmental and social impact and risk assessment process is obviously a key to framing many of the other assessment processes and technical standards. So quite an important topic today. Just taking a little bit of a step back, many of you have joined previous sessions and will have a good background on the context for this consultation process. But I see today we do also have a number of participants that are joining us for the first time, and that's great. We always welcome returning, but also new participants in the consultation process. So before talking a bit more about today's topic, let me just take a step back and give you a little bit more context on the update process. Firstly, ADB's existing safeguard policy, which was approved in 2009, it's now more than a decade old. We had a independent evaluation study, which was completed in 2020. That was done by ADB's independent evaluation department. And they recommended that it was time ADB should undertake a comprehensive update and modernization of the policy. They suggested that we should build on the experience of implementation over the last decade, but also look carefully at the recent safeguard policy updates of other multilateral financial institutions. They also made a number of recommendations about our own systems. They suggested that we should seek to strengthen our own management and oversight systems for our environmental and social risk management and safeguards. They also suggested that we needed more robust supporting guidance for the policy, and that we needed to pay more attention to developing further our own staffing skills, and also continuing to build the capacity of our developing member countries and clients that we work with. So those recommendations were endorsed by ADB's management in full. And then we launched an update process, which kicked off really from August 2020. Now, we are expecting to update the policy over about a 2.5-year period. So we've been underway for some time now, and we're targeting the final approval of the new policy by about March 2023. So we have about a year to go. We are looking at having a draft policy available for further consultation later this year by about September, and then we'll go into further rounds of consultation. Now, if you are joining us for the first time and you're looking for some further information, we do have a safeguard policy update and review webpage. There is a background paper which sets out the approach for the update. There is a stakeholder engagement plan. And then you will also be able to find on that website the series of analytical studies and consultations that we've undertaken so far. And I think already my colleagues have included the links to some of these key materials in the chat box. Excuse me. So please do refer to those for details. Now, coming again to the topic for today on strengthening environmental and social impact and risk assessment. Now, there's just 4 points that I'd like to highlight at the very beginning, just to set the scene for some of the upcoming presentations and discussions. My first point is on the scope of issues and risks to be assessed. Now, ADB's current safeguard policy statement requires the screening and assessment of project-related impacts and risks. And this tends to focus in on the project's direct area of influence. However, there's generally been less attention to assessing and understanding the wider context in which a project takes place. And here I'm looking at some of the associated contextual risks. Things like, for example, is the project being implemented in a fragile and conflict-affected situation? Is there weak governance? Is there weak capacity? Are there security risks? This wider context is all something that we really need to build in more comprehensively to our understanding of the project and the risks associated with it. My second point is on the need for a more integrated approach. Currently, ADB has separate policy standards for environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous peoples safeguards. And we currently screen and categorize and undertake assessment processes for those three areas, largely in a very separate and somewhat siloed way. There is some crossover, but largely they're separate. And we do feel, and this has also come out from the evaluation evidence, that we really do need to take a much more interrelated, integrated process looking at environmental and social impacts, informed by robust social analysis, and really looking at the issues that are shared or contribute to risks across both of those domains. My third point is taking a more comprehensive approach to understand the potential impacts and risks to disadvantaged individuals and groups. Now, this is something that is already within the existing policy framework. It does highlight particularly the need to focus in on disproportionate risks to poor people, to women and children, as well as to Indigenous peoples. It highlights these for specific attention. However, we realize, of course, there is a wider scope of vulnerable and disadvantaged or marginalized people that need consideration. This is something that we're starting to look at more comprehensively. I mean, just for example, people with disabilities, a wider range of people from different ethnic or cultural backgrounds that could, in a particular project setting, be more at risk. We've also got people of different gender identity that can be disproportionately at risk. And all of these, of course, need greater attention for stakeholder engagement and inclusion in the process. Also, intersectionality issues that come up here as well. So again, you know, in this third area that I'm highlighting, I think we need to certainly broaden the scope of considerations here and improve practice. And then lastly, I'd like to highlight the need for a more adaptive and risk-based management approach, which really starts early in project preparation, but continues more comprehensively throughout implementation. And this was something that was highlighted again in the evaluation study. We tend to, at ADB, have a process that tends to front load a lot of screening, assessment, and baseline studies work prior to the consideration of a project for our own management and board consideration before we approve financing for a project. And that's important, particularly when you've got high-risk projects where you need a lot of detailed study. And most of our human resources, our due diligence, appraisal efforts go into this early stage. However, much more attention is needed across the whole project cycle with management systems and attention to capacity, you know, really all the way through. It's really a greater focus on outcomes that it's important. But consistent with that, we also feel like there's some need for more flexible approaches, which looks at, you know, the timing of certain studies based on when they're needed in the whole implementation stage. But a real balance is needed here, and we need to look carefully at how to get that right. So those 4 points I just wanted to highlight at the very beginning, just as a framing for some of the conversation to come. Now, next, my colleagues, Mr. Rada Pham, followed by Ms. Sarah Abbas, are going to provide some further details. Firstly, Ryder with presentation of some of the background on emerging issues and international good practice, and then my colleague Zara on some of the directions that we're thinking of taking from the ADB. After that, of course, we'll be dedicating time to hear your views, and please don't feel shy. We'd like to hear your questions, your comments, and your recommendations. So we'll be looking forward to that very much. With that, let me finish and now pass over to Ryder. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and hello everyone. It's nice to be with you. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm a consultant to the Asian Development Bank, and I've previously worked on environmental and social standards with the World Bank, the IFC, IDB, and the private sector part of the IDB group, IDB Invest. And if we could have the next slide, we'll just give an overview of what we would like to try to talk about in this session. We undertook a study looking at ADB's 2009 risk management framework and try to compare that with what is current and emerging good practice on different topics and approaches among multilateral financial institutions, and how have other MFIs modernized and updated their safeguards policy frameworks. We've identified some areas, room for improvement here, more consistency and more convergence in terms of different institutions' approaches, and how perhaps ADB can incorporate the current and emerging good practice. This is based on a rapid desk study, publicly available information. I have not looked at actual performance and quality on the ground of projects. Next slide, please. The 6 comparator institutions, as you can see here, they all have environmental and social frameworks that are more recent than the ADB's 2009 safeguards policy statement. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the World Bank, the IFC, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and both the public sector and the private sector part of the Inter-American Development Bank group. You see that the World Bank's ESF, which many are familiar with, was effective from 2018. The oldest set of standards here are actually the IFC performance standards. But with the exception of the AIIB, which modeled their overall architecture on the current ADB policy framework, all of these other institutions have modeled their policies and overall architectures very much along the lines of the IFC performance standards, which were first introduced in 2006 and then updated in 2012. There's variation, there is attention to new issues, more explicit attention to different topics. For example, the IDB has a standalone policy on gender. The private sector parts here have more explicitly incorporated principles from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So there's some variation, but the overall architecture is quite similar. Next slide, please. We don't have time to go into detail on all the content of this study, but just to highlight a few that we can talk about today that represent what I think we would now consider basically good practice. A more balanced approach to environmental and social identification of risks and management of them, the overall social assessment process, which includes more systematic, explicit stakeholder engagement, identification of stakeholders, appropriate ways of engaging with different groups, particular attention to disadvantaged and vulnerable groups within that. It is a more comprehensive, better informed risk management system. The older safeguards policies, for example, of the ADB and the World Bank, also prior to their reform on social issues, they had attention to involuntary resettlement and to indigenous peoples, but other social factors and risk aspects were not explicitly incorporated. And we have learned that particularly on the social side, where issues are more qualitative, more context specific, perhaps, there is a need to mention these issues and address them explicitly in the policy framework. Otherwise, they often get subsumed or ignored in an environmental impact assessment process. We have moved, as Bruce alluded to a very front-loaded approach with a lot of emphasis on studies and procedures before projects were approved, to a more balanced approach where we also focus on ongoing implementation, monitoring, and making adjustments through adaptive management when needed. And we'll talk about all of these issues. The World Bank, and to some degree other institutions, have also moved away from the 3-point scale of categorizing risks for their own purposes of due diligence and implementation support. From ABC, it's now a 4-tier risk categorization process with high, substantial, moderate, and low. One of my earlier jobs was to be the regional safeguards advisor for the World Bank in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I was consistently frustrated by the 3-point scale because everything tended to lump into the middle, following a normalized curve, so to speak. With a 4-point scale, we can calibrate effort and support and requirements in a bit more nuanced way. Now, we have introduced a number of other topics and factors of risk considerations. It means that projects need to be looked at in their setting. We cannot have an indicative list of and saying this sector or this type of project is by definition a category A or a high risk project. It could be something that is normally considered a moderate risk, could be a very high risk project if the operating environment, contextual risk factors, weak performance or political will to implement, if those are high risk factors, then this could very well be a high risk. So it is that combination of factors that we're looking at. And we have learned that this does not lend itself to a rigid blueprint approach or check the box type of approach. It requires judgment, which comes with experience, and we're still learning, and we hope to learn from everyone also in this session. It requires flexibility, and it requires sequencing of actions throughout the lifetime of a project. Once we've determined the project risk categorization through early screening and scoping, we will look at issues of what sort of due diligence is required, what upfront requirements in terms of studies, documents, disclosure, plans are required, and what can we put into an action plan that can be implemented during implementation. So the effort and requirements are meant to be proportionate to the project risk and scale and complexity. Next slide, please. I apologize for this slide. It's difficult to read. I think people are getting copies of this for reference. But this is an illustration of a typical risk management framework, the way more and more institutions have adopted it. It's a 3-tier approach with, at the top in blue, we have aspirational vision statements, non-mandatory per se, because it has to do not just with risk management, but it has to do with development opportunities and enhancing sustainable development, attention to climate change, integration of progressive realization mechanisms of meeting international conventions and obligations of governments and other stakeholders. So this is more of vision goal related area. The mandatory requirements are in the middle tier here, and they are of 2 kinds: policies and policy statements containing the key principles, aspects, and expected outcomes in risk management, both on the left on the lender side and on the right on clients, whether it is government or private sector companies. The next group there below that are procedures and organizational structure. Changing policies can be a very, very lengthy process, as you know. It took the World Bank a number of years to change its older safeguards policies. And so the next here really is still a requirement with the lending institution and with clients, but it is typically subject to management decisions, not necessarily to the board of these organizations. And it has to do with procedures and organizational structure, budgeting, and so on, and resource allocation. Procedures, for example, for how the institution will proportionately support clients depending on risk and scale and complexity. Now, the middle red box there, which is difficult to read, suggests that this can be modified or adapted to the particular lending modality or financial instrument used. The core policy principles should be the same throughout, but you would address issues and requirements somewhat differently if you're talking about a technical assistance support program, a traditional investment project, a more programmatic, results-based and outcome-based project, working through financial intermediaries, policy-based lending, and even policy dialogue at a macro level. We do want to elevate this from the transaction focus of investment projects to also being able to use these policy principles in policy dialogue, coordination, strengthening of national systems, country systems, and convergence and common approaches with other development finance institutions. So the procedures will vary a little bit depending on what it is we're talking about here. And I think ADB has one of the advantages of compared with many other development finance institutions, in that even in the 2009 policy statement, the intention was to apply the same principles to different lending modalities and instruments. The World Bank is more limited by contrast. It applies to the environmental and social framework applies to investment operations, but does not apply, for example, to development policy financing. On the client side, and that's what we will focus on today, particularly because it is important to maintain separation of roles and responsibilities for accountability purposes, for clarity. Some things can be joined and can be done and should be done jointly, but basically the principle that it is a client, a borrower's responsibility to identify risks and issues, to consult with concerned and affected stakeholders, local communities and others, and then to integrate these issues, environmental and social risk factors, into project decision-making through designs, implementation and management systems. This is the clear client responsibility. In applying that, they apply a series of standards. And these standards are generally, as I said, modeled on the IFC performance standards. IFC and other institutions also have their own complementary sustainability policy frameworks, which talks about their roles and responsibilities. But clients apply the IFC performance standards. As you know, these have had tremendous uptake and really become the global benchmark in this area. They're, as I said, multilateral financial institutions have generally modeled their new frameworks on those standards. And in the private sector, for example, financial institutions, banks, such as the group of banks associated through the Equator Principles Financial Institutions, around 130 commercial banks around the world, they all apply the IFC performance standards. So there's much greater opportunity for convergence, coordination, and gradual support strengthening of national country systems through consistency in policies and principles, even though organizational structures will vary from institution to institution. At the bottom of this, so there was a question about definition of safeguards, and I see Bruce responded to that. It's it depends on the institution. It's shorthand for talking about identifying and addressing and managing potential environmental and social risks and impacts on people and the environment. But that's a bit of a mouthful to say, so we typically use safeguards as shorthand for this. All of the policies at the World Bank, for example, have moved from being called safeguards policies to being called environmental and social standards. So terminology will vary a little bit. What I was saying, the bottom element here, which on my screen appears in blue, this is guidance, tools, good practice, and other aspects that helps contribute to shared knowledge, learning around these issues. The various institutions involved, and as well as civil society organizations and many other institutions such as academic institutions, constantly publish research, handbooks, good practice notes, sometimes jointly on how to address particular topics on this. So there is a great deal of information available on guidance when it comes to methodologies and approaches. In this session, I want to focus particularly on IFC Performance Standard 1, or the equivalent in other institutions, because that's the one that in some sense acts as an umbrella standard for all the other more topical standards, whether it's resettlement, cultural heritage, indigenous peoples, or other topics. But the Standard 1 contains the key principles, objectives, and elements of identifying risk, managing risks, establishing a management system. It also talks about stakeholder engagement, although in more recent policy frameworks, EBRD, the World Bank, and others have adopted standalone policies on stakeholder engagement and consultation to strengthen and clarify that. All right, moving on to the next slide, please. So the approach, as Bruce said initially, and which I think we'll try to talk a little bit more about now, is that we recognize that our earlier identification of environmental and social concerns were often quite narrow and incomplete. We focused on clear footprint or direct impacts of projects. We were not equally focused on potential risks of adverse impacts. So we moved from focus on impacts more towards broader risks. And just to give a definition of risk, a very simple, basic one to keep in mind, risk is about uncertainty, but it relates to potential negative impacts, damaging something we hold of value, whether it's environmental and social issues. And risk is defined then as the combination of the severity or how bad that impact would be if it occurred, potentially. It is not about certainty yet, it's about potential. And combining that severity with the likelihood or probability of that impact occurring. An impact on the indigenous peoples, critical natural habitat could be disastrous unless it were managed well and we reduce the likelihood and probability of it actually occurring in the first place. And we do that through applying a risk mitigation approach, risk mitigation hierarchy in how projects are designed and implemented. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's basically about having a robust way to identify risks of adverse impacts, avoiding them where possible, including looking at alternatives analysis and a no project alternative also, minimizing them where they occur through alternative designs, reducing the impacts, mitigating, compensating, or offsetting then for residual adverse impacts, such as if there's necessary displacement and resettlement for infrastructure purposes, for example. So these are all basically in that point one here, that the project is concerned with both direct adverse impacts and risks attributable to the project, and also more indirect impacts, such as cumulative impacts where there are third parties involved, where the project may not have full control or leverage over what third parties do, but there's an issue of contribution that we should be concerned with here. Now, that's the traditional focus, but as I said, we focused more on direct impacts than on risks in the past. I think we've broadened this, and we've included attention to a number of topics under those adverse impacts. So in the past on social, as I said, we focused primarily on resettlement and indigenous peoples. Now there are much broader sets of topics that are incorporated into these frameworks. To be able to address these issues, we also look at a number of other risk factors. Different sectors have different levels of inherent risk. A large mining company, extractive industries, a large hydropower dam will have a lot more environmental and social risk involved than, for example, a human development project in health and education. That's not to say that those are risk-free. There could be issues of unequal access to benefits. There could be issues of gender-based violence within situations like that. So all sectors have risks, but at the outset, it does vary a little bit. We focus a great deal now also on point 3. What matters is not just what you do in a project, but where you do it and to whom you do it, if I can call it that. So the natural environment, biodiversity, natural habitats, issues of resource depletion, natural disaster, climate-related events and risks. And on the social side, we would ask, are there disadvantaged or vulnerable groups who may be disproportionately affected by the project or who may lack access to project benefits? And this could be based on gender, ethnicity, persons with disabilities, age, language, religion in some cases. And so this would be assessed on a case-by-case basis. The broader contextual risk factors are risks related to environmental and social issues that are pre-existing also, like the vulnerability and sensitivity, but covering issues such as, are we operating in a situation of fragility and conflict and violence? Is there weak governance? Is there corruption? Are systems of transparency and accountability poorly developed? Are there third-party risks such as further out in the supply chain? Are we associated with a situation where there are pervasive human rights abuses, for example? So these are often pre-existing risks, but they may exacerbate the risks in point 1. Those risks of adverse impacts a project is more directly responsible for. They may make the vulnerability of affected populations worse, internally displaced people because of conflict, for example. So these risk factors are all interrelated. And the final point here in this slide, performance-related risks. This was also something that we did not place enough attention on in the past, I think. But the whole issue around a management structure for project or an institution, capacity, is there a clear normative framework around these issues? Is there management support? Is it integrated into decision-making? Are there available resources, staffing skills, and most of all, perhaps political will and commitment? So these are risk factors that we will address through a more systematic assessment and management process. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about that as a process. In terms of the project cycle, let me first try to illustrate the risk level. If we click once more on this, you'll see that in the typical project timeline, in those cases where we develop a project from the start, from concept through a preparation stage, discussions, negotiations, approval, a long period of implementation, and then transition and closing of a project. Risk levels will vary, as we've said. And if we do choose to use a 4-point scale, as I've done here, you'll see that there are a number of actions that are done before a project is approved, and there are a number of actions that can be done and should be done during implementation. Let's illustrate that with the next click on this slide. A low-risk project will have relatively fewer requirements, fewer actions needed. Each will require less effort, and they can be done relatively quickly, perhaps, before a project is approved. They will still need follow-up actions and monitoring during implementation, but the effort, the resources, the cost would be less. So there's flexibility in that, compared with a high-risk project. If we click on the next segment here, a high-risk project might look something like this. A lot more actions and requirements, both on the lending institution and on the client upfront. A greater effort for each of the actions and requirements. More of them, and more of them being done prior to project approval. Now, so when we talk about sequencing, we're not talking about eliminating upfront requirements. We are saying that definitely a high-risk project will require a great deal more effort, probably take more time to get things as well as we can in the planning process. But we also recognize that any plan does not survive the meeting with reality. Circumstances change, assumptions about implementation capacity may not be met, staff are not recruited, unforeseen risks occur. So in a higher risk project, it is particularly important also to follow through with a number of actions agreed on during implementation, with very careful monitoring and being able to adapt to these circumstances. So the efforts on supervision and implementation support from the lending institution would be considered to be much more intensive in a high risk operation. Now, in the past, I think we were guilty quite often of focusing only on the pre-approval, or mostly on the pre-approval actions, and then literally illustrated by these balls, we dropped the balls often during implementation and did not follow through well enough. So the idea here is to create more balance, but proportionate to project risk and scale and complexity. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a little hard to read. I apologize for the small font here. The issue here is to try to illustrate how some actions may be sequenced. So to give examples, you may have a critical natural habitat, you may want to do a biodiversity assessment, and you should certainly start with that before a project is approved. But you may not be able to account for all seasonal variations, for example, or animal migration at different times. So you'd want to update and finalize that also before any activities happen during implementation to make sure that we know what we're talking about later on. A stakeholder engagement plan will need to be prepared before a project is approved. But again, circumstances will change. We will realize that we need to disaggregate further. Perhaps we need to do intra-household gender analysis, considering men's and women's livelihoods differently. So updating the stakeholder engagement plan and continuing with stakeholder engagement, not just as a prerequisite to approving a project, as an upfront licensing condition, but as something that is carried out and updated with feedback mechanisms to stakeholders throughout the implementation of the project. Similarly, on resettlement, you might have a sense that the project may involve resettlement, but we don't have specific locations or site-specific final designs or plans. So you may start with a framework, which will then be updated with a more site-specific plan as the project proceeds. Let's try to illustrate that with some figures. Click on one here, and we'll see, for example, that studies and consultations will continue. Then the next image, click, would indicate that these ongoing studies and consultations should be reflected in revisions of plans and designs. And I would actually consider this a new principle that we were not good enough about in the past, so to speak. We often dealt with environmental and social issues as an externality to the project. We looked at impacts, perhaps, we developed mitigation plans, tried to implement those, but it wasn't an integral part of how projects were conceived in the first place, how sustainability considerations and environmental and social risk factors influence project choice, and how these issues were integrated into the actual designs and implementation and management systems of a project in decision makings on an equal basis with technical and financial and other considerations. So, but this is the idea here now. This should be an integral part of project decision making. Once you have that, and this is an ongoing and iterative process, if we click on the next here, we will suggest, for example, that, well, if we see there is going to be displacement and other types of impacts that require mitigation measures, such as helping to relocate people and providing them with compensation for assets lost and livelihood support, those measures should be undertaken before the next click here, so to speak. The next click shows that should be put on a critical path so that things are sequenced and these things are done before, for example, physical civil works start. Next slide, please. Now here's another umbrella, and this is also a new principle that national law does not always recognize it in the same way, but the MFIs and other institutions have more and more come to see environmental and social issues in an assessment process and management process, not just as being integrated and better balanced, but also to be defined as an ongoing and iterative process throughout the lifetime of the project. It'll have different actions, different deliverables and milestones, such as specific studies, such as action plans, such as consultation events at different times, but this will continue throughout the lifetime of a project. And in contrast, as you know, most national legislation, if they require an environmental impact assessment, it's conceived of as a standalone study. It requires a report, generally disclosure, but it's a point in time prior to approving a project, and it's not an ongoing process with clarity on what is done when within this. Environmental topics on the left, social topics on the right, but these are all interrelated. Many topics are completely cross-cutting aspects. Environmental topics such as ecosystem services will have social implications because it's, by definition, those elements of the natural environment that affect people. And social issues, indigenous peoples, dependence on natural resources, for example, social inclusion and gender equality. These issues are also related to natural resource use and other aspects. So these are integrated and conceived of as a process. We'll try to illustrate that. Next slide, please. The particular focus on this, as we said, when it comes to social impacts that it is being strengthened, is recognizing that projects may affect and involve vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, and they were often not sufficiently incorporated in the attention of project management in the past. And there are really 4 areas of focus here that I would suggest. One is that disadvantaged and vulnerable groups may be disproportionately affected by project-related adverse impacts. Take resettlement as a classical example again. Land acquisition, if you acquire partial land of a wealthy farmer, that person will be inconvenienced, but if it's compensated appropriately, they won't be worse off than before. In contrast, if you take the land of a poor subsistence farmer who has no other livelihood means, you're not just taking the value of the asset, you're also taking the means of livelihood from that person. And restoring livelihoods and addressing those types of vulnerability issues, it both signifies significant, much more risk, much higher risk, and requires much more effort to deal with. Secondly, even if there are no direct negative impacts from a project, benefits and opportunities, whether it's health, education, access to infrastructure, other aspects, they're not distributed evenly. There are winners and losers, and part of what we're trying to ensure here is that poor and vulnerable groups are not disproportionately disadvantaged when it comes to accessing benefits. There may be systemic issues of discrimination, of social barriers, persons with disabilities may be prevented from using physical infrastructure, transport, for example. Gender inequality may mean that men benefit more from others than others. Caste hierarchies in South Asia may mean that upper caste Brahmins may benefit more through social exclusion and elite capture than, for example, Dalits and Adivasis in India, to take one example. So these systemic barriers matter. Thirdly, we know, of course, that vulnerable groups have less influence. Generally, they have less voice and agency. And even though they may try to have voice, they're not always listened to, so to speak. So part of the process with the project is to ensure that their views and concerns are surfaced, that they're given attention, that they're considered in how projects are designed and implemented. Finally, going beyond risk management, we would want to look at, in the environmental and social assessment and management process, how development opportunities can be targeted better to benefit vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. Now, risk factors and social identities, which is what I would, as an anthropologist, would call many of these issues, they don't exist separate from each other or in isolation. If we click on the next part of this slide, we see that there is this concept of intersectionality. Individuals and groups often have overlapping and multiple sources of vulnerability. A person may be a disabled, illiterate, indigenous woman living in a remote rural village, just to add complexity and factors that may disadvantage her in the development process. So these things act potentially as cumulative risk factors or risk multipliers, if you like, whether it's based on gender, sexual orientation and gender identity, disability, indigenous communities, age, and so on. And the assessment process is intended to identify and address these types of issues. Next slide, please. Again, this is difficult to read, but this is just to suggest in an assessment process and management process of these issues that there are multiple elements and there are some key principles involved here. And there's guidance published on this, handbooks and guidance on this. The International Association of Impact Assessment follows a very similar approach to this. It recognizes that the assessment process and management process, as we said, goes on throughout the lifetime of the project, but it has different aspects and activities and milestones and deliverables at different times. Stakeholder engagement, point 3 here, is listed as a solid bar throughout the lifetime of the project. Other things such as collecting baseline data for comparison studies, point 6 here is more something that we perhaps do during preparation. Establishing management systems, point 7, and integrating them into point 7 and 8 and 9 here, on reporting, on procedures, on management systems, integrating this into decision making. Much of that goes on as part of project preparation, which will need to be continue and be updated during implementation. And the last point being on continued monitoring, evaluations, adaptive management processes throughout the lifetime. None of these elements are independent of each other. They're not done in isolation. If done well, they should influence and inform each other, and there should be feedback mechanisms here. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide, and I apologize for maybe having gone a few minutes over time here. These are some summary issues, considerations for discussion, reflection on how they can be incorporated into a more modern and comprehensive risk management framework. First, ensuring that the framework is well integrated, that it balances environmental and social factors, and that it covers key areas that we've learned constitute risk factors. Secondly, defining that process of assessing and management not as a standalone study, but as an ongoing process. And I would normally say that this really has 3 key pillars. It is analytical, looking at qualitative and quantitative data using primary and secondary sources. It is participatory with the stakeholder engagement process, which is also a source of information and input to decision making. And that's the third pillar, integrating this into management decisions and how projects are implemented. That would also include accountability mechanisms, the ability of affected communities and others to hold institutions accountable, to have rights to remedy, for example, access to grievance mechanisms at different elements, at different levels here. We've talked about better targeting for gender and disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, a broader assessment of different risk categories and seeing how they influence each other. There are risks of adverse impacts that the project may cause. There are risks of adverse impacts that the project may contribute to along with other third parties. And you need to consider control, leverage, or how to strengthen leverage to address these issues. And there may be associated risks of linkage, such as if we're operating in a situation of conflict and violence or human rights abuses. So cause, contribution, linkage, or association, these are somewhat different in how they're managed, but they're all important risk factors. Seeing the assessment process as an ongoing process throughout a lifetime, a better follow through during implementation than before by balancing the pre-approval actions with actions during implementation. And finally, this notion of proportionality, that higher risk projects will require significantly more effort both before and after projects are approved. So that is it. I apologize for taking too much time, perhaps. There's a lot more content in the study. And of course, we look forward to comments and suggestions on how to finalize it. But thank you very much for the attention. Azim.
Thank you so much, Ryder, for the wonderful presentation and also providing us with the clarity, feedback in some of the comparative IFI processes related to the environmental and social risk assessment study that you've authored. And in particular, the issues related to the four-tier dynamic risk categorization that you mentioned, as well as the suggestion that efforts and requirements need to be proportionate to project risk, scale, and complexity. I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. We hope we can get further feedback from you all on what the ADB should consider in these general policy topics, and areas during the facilitated Q&A session that's coming up. The Q&A will run for about 70 minutes, but as I mentioned previously, there is some flexibility in that. But let's now pause for a 5-minute break. Before we actually do depart for the break, can I please invite you to just think about our poll evaluation that we will have a little bit later on, that you should register your written feedback for to help us improve the consultation approach and the level of engagement that we have with stakeholders like yourselves. There's a link that you will see to menti.com, which is posted in the chat box now. So before you head to get your afternoon tea or coffee or favorite drink, just a heads up on some of the guide questions that we'd like you to think about and provide your feedback on when we resume. How can we better engage with stakeholders like yourselves? How can we ensure that you are providing us with the optimal level of feedback, and that feedback is being considered and incorporated into the revised safeguard policy statements? These are issues that I'm sure you've thought about, and if you have specific suggestions and recommendations and options for the ADB to consider, please feel free to share them with us. We'd love to hear from you. When we resume, we're going to hear from Ms. Zara Abbas, a Principal Environment Specialist within the Safeguards Division, who will frame the discussion and set the context for the Q&A session on environmental and social risks. And then that will be led directly into the session that's going to be moderated by Felix Niteti Oku, who is a Senior Social Development Specialist also within the Safeguards Division, who will take us through the Q&A session. The next slide will show you some of the guides questions that we will have on the screen throughout the break. You'll see a timer on the top right-hand corner. Can we have the next slide? The countdown timer appears on the top right-hand corner. When that timer counts down to 0, you'll know it's time to return to your screen. We'll also have a bit of a musical interlude for your listening pleasure during this session, this break. And as the music begins to fade, you'll also know that it's time to return to your screen. So with that, we'll see you in about 5 minutes for the Q&A session prefaced by Ms. Zara Abbas's presentation. Thank you very much and see you soon. Thanks very much and welcome back. We will now have a framing of the risk-based approach that ADB considers necessary and important, as presented by Ms. Zara Abbas, a Principal Environment Specialist, Safeguards Division, SDSS, within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. This context will lead into the environmental and social risk assessment study discussions as facilitated by Felix Oku. So let's start without any further delay. Ms. Abbas, over to you, please.
Thank you, Azim, and good day, everyone. As Azim just said, that I will be giving you a bit of a contextualizing the next session. So in the previous presentation, you just heard about the risk assessment and management approach that over the years has become good practice in considering the impacts of development projects. So we'll just now discuss how we're going to be approaching that. Can I have the next slide, please? The first slide. Thank you. So in order to implement an integrated risk assessment and management approach, ADB plans to align with the practice adopted by comparator MFIs. And we have identified some areas for strengthening, and I will just quickly run through these. The first is the need for an integrated risk-based classification, strengthening environmental and social impact assessment, introducing adaptive risk management, and strengthening safeguards oversight, and lastly, the need for a robust capacity building program for borrowers and for ADB staff. So I'll go through these 5 areas very briefly. Currently, ADB undertakes a significance-based classification of projects, and this is done separately across environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous peoples safeguards. And the most sensitive component in each area is used to determine the category, and each area is categorized separately. For environment, IR, and IP all have separate categories. So in the revised policy, we will consider an integrated risk-based classification system in which one integrated categorization will be undertaken across all safeguard standards based on the location, nature, and scale of impacts as it's done. And also, most importantly, we'll be factoring in borrowers' capacity and other contextual risks. And as Raidar just earlier mentioned in his presentation, this approach is now followed by most comparator MFIs and is good practice. So as part as the environmental assessment process, the current practice to screen, categorize, and assess projects will need to be revised and adapted to incorporate an approach that considers the interlinkages between social and environmental impacts and risks. And the environmental and social impact assessment process would need to focus more on integrating impacts related to gender, impacts and risks related to gender, disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, and other interlinkages. Presently, ADB does undertake, as part of this, the overall process, we do undertake social impact assessments or early assessments of social issues, but these are not necessarily integrated properly or need to be developed into a system which ensures integration at all levels. And along with this, in view of these interlinkages, the guidance for integrated social and environmental impact assessments will also need to be strengthened. Next slide, please. So here I will briefly introduce the next steps that we will be taking to introduce the risk management approach. Most importantly, to ensure the delivery of safeguards outcomes, ADB will focus on strengthening project implementation as well as supervision. To implement a risk assessment and management approach, ADB will need to apply the principle of adaptive risk management. This involves ongoing monitoring and the ability to respond to any unforeseen circumstances. And linked to this is the need to also develop guidance on how to balance pre-approval requirements with actions that can be undertaken later based on the level of risk during project implementation. As explained by Ryder in the previous presentation, more effort is needed for high-risk projects during the due diligence stage, as well as during implementation, including closer supervision and tighter management. So based on the nature and risk of the project, actions that may be undertaken at a later stage need to be agreed upon with the borrower and then reflected as conditions which are binding through legal agreements to ensure that their implementation. The World Bank is currently doing this through an environmental and social commitment plan, which is a legal document. So while having a new approach and associated guidance is very important, it is equally important to strengthen ADB's safeguards oversight, which will require robust risk management systems. And these include appropriate safeguard staffing structure, resources, performance indicators, tracking and performance monitoring tools. And I'd like to just share that we have recently developed and are implementing a project performance rating system and an integrated safeguards management system for tracking the implementation of project level safeguards. And it's expected that by the time that the policy revision and update is completed, ADB will have also reviewed and assessed staffing resources. So lastly, a comprehensive policy implementation plan will be developed for capacity building and establishing strategic partnerships. This will cater to the needs of all stakeholders, and these include what are executing agencies, implementing agencies, contractors, supervision consultants, engineering consultants who are involved with the day-to-day implementation of the projects. And partnerships with other MFIs will be strengthened around the standards and their implementation. And lastly, we'll have policy guidance, good practice notes, and other tools developed for implementation as well. Next slide, please. So with this background of the topic and how we are considering to incorporate it, we would like to hear your perspective on how to better identify the various types of risk factors, which are also discussed by Ryder earlier, and how to address risk as an ongoing feature throughout the project lifecycle, and how to assess the risks of undertaking safeguards due diligence of certain components at a later stage. So we have put together these points in the form of questions to help guide the discussion, and they were also on the screen earlier. So I will now hand over to my colleague, Felix Oku, who will carry the discussion forward. And please feel free to start entering your questions or raise your hand. Thank you. Over to you, Felix.
Thank you very much, Zara. Yep, and welcome to the Q&A session, the moderated Q&A session for this consultation process. This is what I call your session. We've had a lot of presentations from ADB, 3 to 4 presentations, which I would highlight quite briefly. And this is your time to provide some feedback or comment or suggestions, recommendations, or even criticism. So all welcome. I just want to re-emphasize that ADB really welcomes and appreciates your feedback. We always believe that goes to achieve not only meaningful consultation, but strengthening the entire safeguard process. So please encourage all of you to provide feedback. The opportunity to provide feedback has already been suggested. You can use the chat box. And thanks to those that have already addressed some comments. I can see some questions have already been addressed by Bruce, but feel free. We've got enough time to allow everybody to provide feedback. You could also use the raise hand function in the Teams chat could go to the reactions button on the bottom right-hand corner, then you can raise your hand, and we prefer to hear voices from the speakers. So we're quite very keen to see hands raised, and we'll call you. Just to guide the Q&A section, and following Zara's presentation, there are 4 thematic areas that we'd like if we could focus our questioning, comments, and suggestions and feedback on. And the first one has to do with the whole concept of assessing and managing safeguards risk. Then would also like to gauge questions that will come from how to manage the whole contextual risk as presented by Ryder. And third one will be, how do we strengthen inclusion, and how do we address vulnerability in our projects? And the intersectionality concept that also was introduced by Ryder's presentation. The fourth thematic area that we want to look is, how do we increase focus and enhance implementation outcomes? So if there is time as well, and I see maybe we're not covering all these thematic areas, I may prompt with maybe some further questions. Without much ado, maybe we can go into the question now. And I can already see that we've got a question from Lawrence Cornell. Lawrence is the Environment Director for Bank Information Center of the USA. Lawrence, if you're on the call, we'd like to hear you. You've got the floor now. Please unmute. And if at all possible, you could also put the video on so we could put a face to the name. Quite a well-known name in any way. You on the call, Lawrence?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I didn't know I was going to be called on, but I appreciate the opportunity. And I did want to say that what you have presented seems very clear and well thought out. So I do appreciate the approach that ADB is taking overall on this. I think one of the major concerns going forward is globally climate change, and that is sort of an overarching concern that something can impact just about any project in any location. So one of the concerns that we have is how ADB will strengthen its assessment for climate change risks. And the other piece of that I just wanted to mention is the role of nature in climate change, and that there's a parallel biodiversity crisis along with the climate crisis that we're facing. So I'd be very interested in how those risks will be better assessed and responded to under a new safeguard system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, concise twofold question. Thank you. And thanks for your kind feedback on the consultation, how open and transparent you think the consultation process has been going on as well, Lauren. I would direct the twofold question, I think, to Bruce in the first instance. First question has to do with how we're going to strengthen and enhance our safeguard assessment process to address climate change risks, and which is also very closely linked to the original question which Lawrence posted on, if I've been specific, it says, are we going to put, restrict or enhance our assessment to ensure that critical or natural habitats will be designated as no zones or no-go zones to prohibit any financing related to unsustainable, extractive, industrial, environmentally, and or socially harmful activities within them. Over to you, Bruce.
Excellent. Thanks, Felix. And thanks so much, Lad. Great, as always, for you to join the session, and really good questions. So firstly, appreciate just, some support in terms of the approach that we're taking. Secondly, on climate change. So yes, this is obviously a very critical issue that we need to consider in the policy context. Actually, we'll be having a consultation on climate change. We're doing some separate studies there that'll be coming up, I think, in about 2 weeks' time. So stay tuned for that. But I'll just mention a couple of points now. Obviously, the risk assessment has to consider a broad range of risks that Ryder was setting out in his presentation, and we'll actually have a wider range of standards than we currently have in the existing policy. Right now we've got environment, involuntary settlement, and Indigenous peoples requirements, but we'll be splitting environment out into a broader range of considerations. And also adding a range of other social considerations, including labour and working conditions. So that already gives you sort of a broader focus on the number of issues and risks to be considered in the assessment process. And climate change is certainly one important one. Now, ADB already actually screens all of our projects for climate risks, and then we undertake more detailed climate risk and vulnerability assessment for any projects that would be considered of high to medium risk, essentially anything other than a low risk, which is most projects. However, there is some gap there in that tends to focus on what is the risk of a change in climate for a project and a project context. So, for example, if you've got in a particular location a trend towards a drying climate, and a project is going to be affected by that, then it's looking at those risks and it takes that into consideration into project design or adaptation measures. But of course, projects themselves are going to have some interaction with that. A project that's using water, if it's in a drying environment, you could have a reduction in downstream flows affecting other water users. And that could lead to further vulnerabilities and risks for communities. So that relationship with the whole project assessment and the safeguards work needs to be brought in more comprehensively. So that's something that we're looking at, and we'll discuss more when we come to that climate change paper. In addition, of course, to mitigation aspects. Then onto the role of nature. Absolutely agree. We did a separate consultation, which I think you joined as well, on biodiversity and sustainable natural resource management. And we've recently also signed the joint MDB statement on nature, stimulating nature positive investment, and also managing nature and biodiversity risks more comprehensively. So that gives a framing for this policy context. So we're looking at the details there. And if I come to also the comment that you had, I think in the pre-meeting that Felix had just raised, which was about what areas of critical or natural habitat might ADB be considering potentially as no-go zones or prohibited for financing. I'll just speak a little bit about that. So we're currently looking at the details, and there's a few things that we're looking at there. Firstly, we do recognize the need to strengthen the policy with regards to critical habitat requirements. For critical habitats, we need a clear priority for avoidance of impacts. We need to have much greater clarity and limitations, I would say, on the use of offsets, particularly for critical habitats. And we need to have requirements for achieving net gains of biodiversity, not just what we have in our current policy, which is no net loss, but really we need to push up for net gains with a net positive investment type of approach. So that's something where I think we need to go further. In addition, we are considering the scope for potential no-go areas or exclusion areas. For example, natural or mixed World Heritage sites, Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, or free-flowing rivers. But of course, there's a scope of other areas that have been proposed, which we're looking at. We need to take a science-based approach there and look at what's practical to implement. So we're evaluating those options at the moment. I would say, though, that there's maybe one caveat with looking at no-go zones is that we do need to allow projects that can deliver on conservation goals. For example, support for conservation projects or park management, which could be in critical habitats, but where we want to be able to support investments in those areas if they're going to have a goal for nature positive investments. So that's where we also need to balance, not necessarily just having a complete exclusion, but something that will allow conservation gains as well. So that's what we're considering at the moment, but we are planning to have some further outreach on this. So I hope that covers it, Lad, but happy to come back for further discussion during the session. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a good response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lad. And thanks, Bruce, for that detailed response to Lad's question. I think it's the chat room is getting busy and it's getting lively, so we will continue with the next round of questions. We've seen a couple of hands raised, and we're very grateful and appreciative of that. Shall we call on Mark Moreno of Recourse? You got your hand raised up. If you want to call, you've got the floor now. Unmute the mic, and then you could put a video on as well. Thanks, Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Moreno Pascual. I work as a finance campaigner at Recourse. Recourse is a nonprofit organization based in the Netherlands that campaigns towards financial institutions to ensure finance flows are directed away from fossil fuels. First, I wanted to say thanks for that wonderful presentation from Rydar. Really appreciate and really encouraging to see the extent to which the ADB has compiled and analyzed best practices when it comes to risk assessment standards and how to get lessons from there to improve ADB's own assessment practices. I just wanted to raise a question regarding FIs specifically. The SPS currently recognizes several policy gaps when it comes to the extent of safeguards applicable to sub-projects financed through financial intermediaries. For example, the lack of applicable policies on involuntary resettlement and a policy on indigenous peoples. And I see how those two are addressed somewhat in Ryder's presentation with the integrated environmental and social assessment process. But more importantly and fundamentally speaking, the SPS also recognizes the lack of ADB oversight and leverage when financial intermediaries are appraised and funds are disbursed. The SPS also states that clarifying the requirements at the FI level requires the ADB to strengthen its review of financial intermediaries' business activities. And while the environment policy addresses FIs partially, I think this is still insufficient considering the nature of FIs and the lack of transparency in the sub-projects that get financed. And Bruce mentioned earlier that this new approach is meant to look at the wider context of risk. So I wonder if in that wider risk context, I assume an indirect type of risk also includes high and substantial risk FI sub-projects, and whether this new approach would be applied consistently in these types of lending, and whether the consideration of project impacts extends to sub-projects as well. So my question really is how this new risk-based approach is addressing these existing problems with FIs, and how concretely will it be applicable to FI sub-projects in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for I think that very detailed question. Yes. So just to maybe recount, your key question has to do with the IED finding on the SPS weaknesses in addressing our financing modality on the FIs. You've highlighted the key issues, limitations and policy gaps, especially with upfront due diligence and even with capacity and leverage during project implementations as regards sub-projects. What your question would what you would like to know is whether with the 4-tier categorization, dynamic risk categorization that was highlighted by Ryder, whether that could address some of these issues. So in the first instance, I would direct that to Ryder, and I'm sure Bruce would also want to follow up with internally and some enhanced business internal processes to address some of these issues. So over to you, first of all, Ryder, the 4-tier dynamic risk classification, and probably with your benchmarking where how that is addressing some of the policy gaps that were highlighted with FI implementation and SPS in ADB. Over to you, Ryder.
Yeah, this has been addressed differently by different multilateral financial institutions, as you know. The IFC, for example, uses externally, they use a more traditional ABC categorization of direct investments and transactions, and they use an FI 1, 2, 3 for sort of high, moderate, lower risk when it comes to financial intermediary lending. So there are some variations on this. I don't see any reason why one could not use a more nuanced risk categorization scheme also for financial institutions. But it is a different model because since it covers everything from potentially investments in large infrastructure to housing loans to student loans, with many banks being supported in a country and each bank having hundreds, if not thousands of clients and tens of thousands of sub-projects, the direct line of sight from ADB via the financial intermediary, via the client to the sub-project when they are in the tens of thousands is not, it's neither realistic nor the intention of that way of working. The idea here is to try to develop greater scale of impact on a positive note. You can leverage an engagement into covering a whole sector as opposed to on a retail basis, transaction by transaction, right? The disadvantage, as you point out, Mark, is that you don't have that direct line of sight. You don't have that control and direct leverage with individual sub-projects. So I would certainly support an approach that does a more strategic analysis of these risks in a sector, in a country that looks, for example, at different banks and how they operate. Now, the general area of sort of direct responsibility and what an organization like ADB would track, as you know, are basically two aspects. One is, does the financial intermediary have a robust enough environmental and social management system? In other words, can they operate in the same sense with due diligence, risk categorization, oversight of their clients as ADB would do with its direct clients in direct investments, right? So the first is the management system. The second would be an overall assessment of the risk profile of the portfolio, right? And that's where you need to sample, assess what combination of investments are there targeted investments. Is it a general purpose investment and loan here? If I'm allowed one example here, I think this needs to be addressed through multiple ways of entry. I think the financial intermediaries and the banks, it's hard to achieve systemic change transaction by transaction. You need a more strategic systemic engagement. Perhaps, building more on private sector banks, holding them accountable if they have claimed to be members of the Equator Principles financial institutions that are supposed to build on and apply the IFC performance standards is one such initiative, sort of focusing on how well they perform. A second issue is to work through something called the Sustainable Banking Network globally, which works with national regulators and central banks to try to strengthen the national regulatory framework in the banking sector to adopt environmental and social standards and governance standards. So I was involved in an intensive program on this in Honduras recently, where an association of 15 commercial banks in the country basically got together and said, we need to have a common platform, we need to have similar standards so we don't have a race to the bottom or so that we don't lose out on foreign investments. And they asked for help in developing national standards, which were recently adopted by the National Regulatory Commission for Financial Institutions in Honduras. And similar initiatives are happening in different countries. I think the multilateral financial institutions, such as the ADB, that work both with public and private sector institutions, have a comparative advantage here compared with IFC, which works only with the private sector institution transaction by transaction, if you like, or sometimes the World Bank, which doesn't work so much directly with the private sector. So by working both with sovereign and non-sovereign clients, you have the opportunity to strengthen, if I may use the term, synergies, coordination, leverage, and move from a transaction focus to a more systemic change. I apologize for the lengthy answer, but as you know, this is an issue of a great deal of debate, and it's a complex set of issues.
Thank you very much, Ryder. Yeah, I think, and maybe Bruce would want to come and touch on, Mark mentioned the need for transparency. I think that also relates to information disclosure. With FI implementation, maybe internally in ADB, want to touch on one of those issues, Bruce?
Yes, thanks, Felix. Thanks a lot, Mark. This is a really important issue, and one we need to give a lot of attention to. Actually, I know some of our other sister MDBs, like the EIB, for example, have been having a lot of extensive discussions. Where you're sitting in the Netherlands, you've probably been involved in some of that. So we've been looking at what discussions have been happening and the learnings from that. A few points just to add to some of the really good points that Ryder's mentioned already. Firstly, on our portfolio, actually, our portfolio with financial intermediaries tends to be fairly low risk at the moment. We have very few that actually would include what we call our category A projects, so those with potential for significant adverse impacts and risks, larger infrastructure investments, very few. And I would say our teams working on projects tend to be fairly risk averse on taking those types of investments on because of the challenges of being able to cascade requirements down and then provide the right level of oversight. So you need to ensure that there is a really robust environmental and social management system to match that portfolio. And that's where a risk-based approach, where we, as Ryder was saying, assessing the systems, looking at the portfolio, looking at the capacity, the commitment, resources, and management that needs to be in place is really critical. So we need to take a closer look at how we can achieve that. But a lot of the projects that we have in the portfolio are also really important and actually quite low risk, like financing for micro, small, and medium enterprises, like women's-based livelihood initiatives that we have with some financial intermediaries that support, grants of like 20,000, small loans of like $20,000 for women's enterprises. So you need a very different type of an approach for those. So, balancing risk is something that we need to look very closely at. The other issue is on information disclosure. And, that's something where, again, need to balance that. We actually just had consultations recently with some of our clients. They also want clarity on the disclosure arrangements. And I think they're also, through corporate social responsibility and responsible banking, are also being pushed from other directions around disclosure, but they're concerned about certain issues around commercial confidentiality and their clients. So that's where we need to find a way that allows them to have the commercial confidence while also disclosing the right information about environmental and social issues that should be transparently disclosed. So that's another issue to work through. But you're welcome to have further submissions on this issue, Mark and other colleagues, because it's an important one. In fact, I won't put Felix on the spot. He's our moderator today, but he's actually one of the people leading on this topic and would explain better than I do. But we'll be running now in May a consultation on financing modalities, and we'll pick up on this topic more then. So
thank you very much. Yep, thanks very much, Bruce, for that detailed discussion. And Mark, we're happy to have a bilateral discussion on what's following here. If I may just put my FI hat on, I may just touch on one or two things. We've got policy, as Bruce indicated, on access to information policy, on disclosure and transparency on project level information. Critical challenge that we have, and we're trying to work around it, has to do with disclosure of ESMS, which is a critical a safeguards instrument for all our FIs, environmental social management systems. Some of the content relates to corporate activities, and there are some commercial confidentiality issues with full disclosure. And some of the banking institutions, including PE funds, that use the modality also, are publicly listed entities, which if the redacted information are not disclosed appropriately, could affect their share values and their financial viability. But yes, there is a place for transparency, and I think the enhanced SPS update will give us maybe better mechanisms to leverage on those aspects as well. Thank you so much for your question, which is very, very important. We continue with our consultation, and I can see a few more hands raised there. I can see a lot of participation from the academia here. The New York University School of Law, we got 3 hands raised. We'll call you in 10, and maybe we'd like to give the floor first to, we just did Tom Bowman. We go with Tina Laritz. If you're on the call, you may unmute and give your question. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much, Felix. I'm actually going to hand it off to Tom, if that's all right first. We have a couple of related remarks, and he's going to start us off, if that's okay.
Excellent, that's fine. Over to you then, Tom.
Thank you. And is my audio coming through okay here?
Yes, loud and clear.
Perfect. So first of all, my name is Tom, and I'm going to be speaking a bit on behalf of the International Organizations Clinic at the New York University School of Law. And I'll try to keep our comments brief, but they do kind of touch on all 4 of the themes that we've identified for this moderated discussion here. And in particular, our clinic has really been examining how multilateral development banks, such as the ADB, might adequately consider digital risks in the safeguard policies. And so we're really interested in some of the comments that both Bruce and Rydar made at the beginning, in particular, Bruce's comments about some of the gaps in the ADB safeguards policies related to the wider context for social risks, such as security risk and other things that might be more classified as indirect risks, as Rydar was talking about. And then we also want to focus on some of the other general or best practices related to digital risk, particularly with mind to the stakeholder engagement and a more balanced approach to the social assessment. So again, giving maybe a little bit of context from where we're approaching this from, looking back, the ADB from 2000 to 2015 supported some 400 projects in ICT worth nearly $12 billion, and promoting digital technologies and advanced technologies and the related innovations is a key component of the ADB strategy for 2030. We think it's pretty important to recognize that from publicly available documents, it doesn't look like digital risks are really considered much in the ADB safeguards policies at the moment. But given that the ADB is using this review process as an opportunity to kind of embrace new development strategies, we think it's really important to consider how digital risks may be exacerbating existing risk or creating new risk of harm for individuals and communities. So a lot of our research has really focused on how projects and technical assistance with technology components may include elements or narratives of techno-solutionism, this idea or assumption that technology can be used to address all sorts of problems while still promoting democracy, freedom, development, and so on. And while this is definitely the case under the right conditions, that digital technologies can promote economic and social development, there's also growing evidence from around the world that this can create substantial risks that could be characterized as digital or social risks. And even in the most severe cases, that some of these risks may dramatically undermine the stated objectives of the projects themselves. And this is really where we've been focusing. And just one example of this is, again, talking about like the vulnerable groups or social exclusion that Rydar identified as some of these more indirect risk factors that really need to be considered. So, 2 things that we'd really like to highlight as general concerns is that first, ICT and ICT related projects are often based on assumptions of advancing stated development goals, such as poverty reduction, gender equity, or improving agricultural production. But these assumptions often lack a basis in evidence. And then the second is that projects with digital dimensions often lack deliberative planning and wide stakeholder consultation, which in effect leads to little to no consideration of the real footprint of projects or which communities are actually going to be impacted and how exactly they're going to be impacted. Now, all of this, I think, will provide like a much more detailed analysis and recommendations in our written submission. But for now, I'd like to pass, if possible, I'd like to pass the floor to my colleagues, Tina and Joyce, who can maybe provide a little bit more concrete examples of some of the digital risks that we're talking about with reference to some specific ADB projects, both involving sovereign lending and non-sovereign lending. So if possible, I'd like to yield the floor to Tina here.
Yes, that's fine. Tina, Joyce.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks, Felix. So in one of the projects that we looked at in our clinic, the ADB provides technical assistance to DMCs to process Earth observation imagery data on cloud platforms through the use of artificial intelligence models. And the purpose of this processing is to improve agricultural and coastal planning within the DMCs. So as my colleague Tom noted, these projects can create all sorts of new risks and exacerbate existing risks within the context of the project. And in this EO project that we looked at, we wanted to highlight quickly two risks that we thought were especially salient, and these are the risk of surveillance and infrastructural dependence. So in this project, the government is granted access to satellite data and processing models, but there's no consideration of the relevant regulatory frameworks in which they operate, and there's no additional safeguards analyzing the risk associated with this. And this can tend to create a centralized surveillance infrastructure within the DMC that goes well beyond the purpose of the project and can lead to a host of social harms and a stifling of civil society in the DMC. So for example, in Cambodia, which is one of the countries involved in this EO project, the government prevented a community group from using satellite data to illustrate deforestation within its borders. And this surveillance power is also ripe for abuse with respect to individuals. So allowing governments to collect this data and enabling them to do so gives them access to a whole new set of information on individuals relating to their livelihoods, their occupations, where they might be living, all without their consent or knowledge. And this can pose a serious threat to these individuals' autonomy, privacy, and security. And it can also more widely really inhibit the ADB's goals of pursuing sustainable and equitable development. And lastly, without due consideration of the legal arrangements between the different parties involved in the project, these projects tend to create a dangerous dependence on the technology itself. And this is especially pertinent because the DMCs don't own the data, the models, or the cloud platforms that they're going to be using in these projects. So it requires more than just data protection to mitigate these digital technology risks. And we would advocate that it really needs a social assessment prior to their implementation to determine whether investing in their development is a good idea and the best way to go about this. So I'm going to hand it over to Joyce to talk about how we thought about this in the private lending context.
Thanks, Tina. We also looked at the Asia Pacific Remote Broadband Satellite Internet Project. So this is a project in which ADB funds widespread internet access in the region, specifically to rural communities, and it financed Pacific, which is a private company, to do this. And there are risks that we noted that if evaluated by ADB in advance, it might help it meet the goals of the project and achieve development effectiveness at the same time. So first of all, we looked at how the project actually lacked the requirement of affordability of internet to the communities served by the project. So as of the moment, the cost is actually of the internet is more than double what the World Bank estimates as an affordable entry-level broadband subscription. And so the goal of affordable internet access to the communities was actually maybe not reached after all. And second, one of the goals of the project is to promote gender equality, but at the moment, contextually, the women in the rural areas don't have access to smartphones and aren't digitally literate. So they might not even have the capacity to use the internet. And maybe there could have been there may be further assistance to these women to avoid exclusion. Third, we look at sustainability, maintenance, and repair. As a very concrete example, after the volcanic eruption in Tonga, it took 5 weeks to restore internet service. So that was an impact that could have been assessed earlier. Fourth, and finally, we looked at Pacific being a private company. And since it's a private company and the project spans multiple jurisdictions, it might have been important to assess legal and regulatory issues affecting the provision of internet access. So basically, we're just making the suggestion that consultation and assessment of the risks of technologies, even where social impacts might not be obvious, is important. And we'll be, of course, submitting a more detailed submission eventually. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Tom and Joyce and Tina. That's quite very robust. It feels like some kind of detailed research been done on the ADB webpage. So kudos to you. Let's try and see how we could, I can point this to the right people to give you some kind of a response in that case. On the whole issue of digital technology, I think digital risk, cyber risk is come on our radar. And I know Bruce has been working internally on some work. So I'll point it in the first direction for Bruce to come on and touch broadly what we've been doing in terms of the policy update and some collaborative work I've been doing with some sister institutions as well on digital technology. And then Tina, with your kind of case study that you show in the sovereign side, that's it on our public sector, yes, pretty much well that project. I think some of the risks that you mentioned, issues with surveillance, issue with sustainability, lack of maybe regulatory framework review, and how that could enhance the social outcomes of the project. With the Cambodia case study that I mentioned, livelihoods and others, privacy issues, I think the ones that I would maybe request Charles Deliver, previously of the World Bank. He has some kind of experience there with the implementation of the ESF, and maybe would want to come following Bruce on those elements and share some practices on that. Same goes as well to you, Joyce, with the non-sovereign side. I'm quite very familiar with that, like Pacific project, and some of the issues that you mentioned, affordability, especially to women targeted who may be less literate in those instances. And your four key points that you mentioned, issue with sustainability and repair, and also need to look at the regulatory framework given that Pacific is a private owned company. Let me hand to Bruce, first of all, to touch on the broad issue on digital technology and the security risk it poses, both new ones that it introduces and the risk to exacerbate existing ones as well. Over to you, Bruce, and then Charles will follow in turn.
Great, thanks, Felix. And huge thanks, Tom, Tina, Joyce, that was great little mini presentation. I really appreciate the research, the details that you've been going into and the points that you just raised. In fact, I think, Joyce, you mentioned that you're compiling some information. You can share that. Love to have it. In fact, it's an area that we are working on. We've actually established a working group inside ADB to look at these issues. So, your research can actually feed into that process. But, certainly digital technologies, their use globally in our region and our financing is increasing. And it is part of our strategy 2030 to increase, support for digital technologies. But, the scope of technologies and their use and their sophistication, and then the risks associated with them are all increasing. In fact, on the risk side, in novel ways that we're still experiencing. So, it's a rapidly evolving field, concerns about data protection, privacy, access, cybersecurity, biased algorithms, You know, there's a lot, and you've touched on many as well. So there's a whole range of risks to consider. It's actually come up already in the context of some of our projects over the last couple of years, the need for more attention to the identification and screening and risks. So, you know, like we've been talking about in today's session, you know, this is a whole area of risk, and one that we've not traditionally covered in our safeguards framework, but we now need to consider appropriately, whether it's in the environmental and social safeguards or through another framework, but it, you know, clearly needs to be there. The working group that we've established in ADB, it's led actually by our digital technology team, but in partnership with my team. And then we've got our operations colleagues involved in this. There's a few things that we're looking at now. One, some broad assessment with a study that we've commissioned, basically looking at technologies and risks. So, you know, understanding the landscape of issues. Also looking at how current regulatory frameworks across our region and across the world deal with these issues. And there's emerging regulatory frameworks in countries such as, you know, Europe and in other places, but there's a lot of gaps as well. So we're trying to understand that landscape. You know, the countries that we work with, obviously we need to comply with regulatory requirements, but there may be gaps in those. We're expecting a lot of gaps, so we need to understand that. We're also in the process of developing what you might call a sort of a screening checklist, which can be used to guide our project teams when they're doing digital technology investments to the types of issues they should be aware of. And most likely this will be a sort of a phased approach, with the first rapid screening and then identifying projects that then need more detailed assessment. So you can take sort of a risk-based approach there. And then in a second stage, we're looking at developing more detailed good practice guidance. But we can see that that's something that would need to be developed and then updated regularly, because it, you know, it's such an evolving field. And then finally, we're not sure yet, and this is a point of debate we have to have inside ADB, and we're happy to have recommendations, of course, whether this comes into the new E&S policy or there's some other directive. But I think regardless of that, we clearly need to be doing more in this space. So certainly aware of it, and your comments today and anything that you'd like to share with us further would be a great input into that process. So thanks again, really appreciated it. Now, Charles might like to come in as well. If there's anything you want to add, Charles, from your experience or insights from the World Bank.
Bruce, I think you've given a great answer to this really challenging issue. I think COVID helped MDBs understand the scale at which we have to address privacy issues, because suddenly we were looking at, how do you disperse medicine to tremendous numbers of people in a sector where very often you need to keep the data confidential. As well, these large-scale social safety net programs where often women are at risk when community knows that they may be receiving cash. All these issues are just legion now. Like Bruce indicated, within the World Bank, we had this discussion of whether this should fall within the environmental and social framework. I think, as Rydar described the emerging trends within environmental and social standards, there is some comfort in the fact that these key social risk principles of non-discrimination, social inclusion, meaningful participation, and then when you see, for example, in standards on stakeholder engagement, that individuals be able to participate in projects without the fear of reprisal or retaliation, that can help carry out the social assessment that Tina was referring to. I think we're also very aware in the World Bank of good projects that can lead to unexpected, unfortunate circumstances when, for example, I think maybe Tom or Tina mentioned, when you're doing environmental protection projects, surveying the areas, and that data is misused maybe by gangs or traffickers to use it for the wrong purposes. So in fact, within the Multilateral Financial Institution Working Group, in which Bruce leads the ADB, I know there's been some discussion starting on this. So I think your research is very useful, and I think this is something all the banks really need to take very seriously. Just one other kind of project where this has come out in large aspects as well: voter supporting projects, where you're trying to get voter identification, but that can also be misused for political purposes. So very real issue and needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. I'll just say very quickly too, as a final add-on, you know, these types of consultation processes, which are being used more and more, including in stakeholder consultations at country levels, are clearly another form of risk. And, you know, without going into the details there, it's something I've actually asked our team to have a look at and think about developing good practice guidance. You know, it's come up, you know, in the context of some of these consultations. How do you ensure that there's no risks of retaliation for people that are joining consultation processes? What are the best practices? You know, this is another technology interface that we need to think about. So yeah, lots of issues. Thank you. Back to you, Felix.
Yeah, thank you very much to you, Tom, Tina, and Joyce. Great job. And thanks also for the detailed response from Charles, Bruce on the subject. Hope to connect with you guys later. We continue with our consultation, and probably maybe we may take what may be the last comment comes from Mark. Mark is a consultant that is well known to us, Mark Broomfield. He's been helping us to do some of the analytical work on air quality. Mark, your question says you can see the benefits of the adaptive and flexible risk management system as proposed in Ryder's presentation, but you wonder how readily this can be implemented into the design and assessment of our investment process projects. The message you said you receive is that unambiguous information on standards and performance is needed to ensure that safeguards are maintained during the implementation phase. But you were a bit concerned that a more flexible risk-based approach may open up gray areas which might be exploited during the project implementation phase, resulting in less effective management of environmental impacts. And I would like to maybe reach out to Charles, who may want to touch on the implementation commitments from the World Bank ESF experience. Charles, if you're there, you come back and touch on this.
Yeah, thanks, Felix.
Excellent.
And also, again, Ryder mentioned that risk is actually more well identified and addressed under these emerging practices than before, and that adaptive risk doesn't mean some sort of lesser conviction to maintaining the environmental and social standards that are drawn into the project, and that is through the environmental and social commitment plan. The commitment plan then enables you in that legal instrument to document the standards that are agreed, and they become a very visible, legally enforceable measure that can only be adapted or changed if the circumstances warrant it, and if there is a legal process to amend the commitment plan, including engaging with stakeholders who would have been involved in setting those standards at the inception of the project. So, Mark, I don't think the concern you have is really based on the setting of those particular standards, because they will be enshrined in the commitment plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Ryder, you may want to touch a bit on this one as well.
Well, just to add that in my experience, we had a fairly naive belief in the past on trying to put everything into a document up front and then assuming that things would happen as written in documents. I think a key definition of risk is that it does involve uncertainty and perhaps in some cases ambiguity in the situation and gray areas. So I think the risk-based approach of continuing to monitor these issues or being open to adapting and changing and responding to circumstances that we had not clearly identified or that have changed during implementation, I think that is a strengthening of the approach rather than a weakening of the approach.
Thank you very much, Ryder. I think we've got a hand raised up, so we will take that one as our last one, and that comes from Leo Bernack of ITUC. Leo, if you on the call, you've got the mic, unmute.
Thanks very much. On this subject, and thanks, Radar, for the really detailed presentation. Apropos of what was just said, I want to touch on what we've seen as a recurrent pattern in the implementation of ESS2 on labor at the World Bank, which is first an ESRS that is very often non-specific, quite short, and often jumps ahead to measures that will be taken without first identifying risks. So there's sort of a lack of risk identification. And then secondly, a really recurrent pattern across the portfolio for several years now of the only or perhaps one of two environmental and social commitment plan items being the creation of a labor management plan. So there's a problem here in that you're not clearly identifying the risks specific to that project. And then in the ESCP, it's just punting down the road to a labor management procedures rather than identifying risks, responding to those in the ESCP, and then, as I think we've talked about today, updating if new risks or issues arise and addressing those, perhaps with those tools, perhaps with others. But I just want to put that out there in terms of how we think about the process here and maybe avoiding that problem with the ADB's ESIA safeguard. Thanks.
Very, very useful question, and thank you very much, Leo. So I may point this in the direction of Charles in the first instance, and I'm sure maybe Ryder would want to touch on it. It's specific. I mean, you've mentioned you've seen a recurrent pattern. There's a problem with the application of ESS2 in particular, that the ESRS, the Environmental Social Review Summary, it's quite very narrow in terms of scope and doesn't identify the risk. And hence, that is also cascaded into the ensuing ESCP, that's Environmental Social Commitment Plan, which tend to focus a lot more on procedure. So your question then was, how could some of these lessons be avoided in the ADB's SPS updates, if we should go along those lines? Charles, if you're on the call, you may give the first response to this, and Ryder, feel free if you want to follow up comment on this.
Sure, thanks, Felix, and hi, Leo, good to see you. I think one has to really look at these on a case-by-case basis. I mean, when I've looked, I left the bank about 10 months ago, when I looked at some ESRSs lately, I've seen some pretty robust ESS2 descriptions of the labor and working conditions in the particular project. I do know, as probably everyone on the call is well aware, that there was a large period starting in the early spring, March 2020, when there were no field missions. And so the ability to really identify risk in projects in the multilateral financial world was under the unique circumstance of COVID, which meant that the degree of risk analysis everybody understood was limited. So I think to a certain extent, one needs to really look at this as we emerge from COVID. I know that field missions are now back, and the detail that is necessary under all the ESSs is now much more accessible to teams. So I think one has to look at it in a trend. The labor management procedures in many cases, I think, are seen by teams to be embedded in the ESCP. So one also would have to look at that. But you're right to look at these and identify areas where you think there may be risk missing, and so that we evolve these to fully adhere to what ESS2 requires. So yeah, I think we have to look at it really on a case-by-case basis to identify where there might be gaps. It's hard to make sort of a general response without looking at individual circumstances.
Thank you very much, Charles. And Leo, I hope that sort of clarifies your question, but feel free to reach out to us if you got any follow-up question. I think this is probably where we bring the curtain down on the Q&A session. And I want to express sincere gratitude and thank you for taking time off your busy schedules and coming even this time to participate quite very actively on the Q&A session. I hand over now to my colleague Azim for the wrap-up.
Thanks very much, Felix. Ryder, Charles, Bruce, Zara, Madhu, as well as others behind the scenes, you know who you are. But of course, a special thanks to all of you, our participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of the questions, the sharing of experiences, the constructive feedback, and of course, that very impressive coordination at NYU on the comments. I just want to reiterate that these types of comments on the environmental and social risks that are received on this consultation and hereafter will be considered, of course, in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. But please don't go. As you see on your screen, we need your feedback. We've got a question there that you can see. Please rate your satisfaction with today's session from 1 to 5, 5 being the most satisfied to 1 being the least satisfied or very dissatisfied. Give us a rank on a scale of 1 to 5, if you will. And then after you've done that, please, for the next 2 or 3 hours, the mentee poll that I referred to you earlier is still going to be open for you to provide us feedback on. You can post your comments on mentee.com in the specific link that is being provided in the chat box now. We want to hear how we can improve the level of engagement, the level of satisfaction, the level of discourse and interaction with you, the stakeholders, to see how we can best gauge feedback, how we can encourage participation, how we can facilitate input into the updated and revised safeguards policy statement. So if you have any constructive ideas, please feel free to share them with us on the mentee.com poll through clicking on that link. But for now, please give us a ranking of 1 to 5, 5 being the most satisfied, 1 being the least satisfied with your impression of today's consultation. We'd like to close this poll in the next 5 to 10 seconds. So if you could do that now, we can relay back the results of the poll to you immediately to show you how not only you voted, but how colleagues and other stakeholders and participants in this session have voted. After the poll, we will have, there we go, 10% said neutral, which means that 90% gave us a ranking of 4 or better. 40% said they were highly satisfied. 50% ranked us 4, somewhat satisfied. But it's the 10% that ranked us neutrally and the 50% that said that they were somewhat satisfied that should take the opportunity to feed back on the mentee.com and give us specific feedback on how we can improve your satisfaction and the level of engagement with you as stakeholders through consultations like this. So thank you all for your feedback. We look forward to hearing further feedback on menti.com. Thank you all for your feedback and the overall participation. I now bring you back to Director of the SDCC and this process, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to give us a summary of what we've heard and to walk us through the next steps after this consultation. Bruce, could you please review the discussions and our next steps? Over to you, sir.
Great, thanks very much, Azim, and thank you again to everyone that joined today. It was a really interesting session. I apologize that today, though, we probably had more presentation material from us, just setting the context than we might normally do on these consultations. And that's maybe cut a little bit into our time, but we've gone a little bit longer. And I did really appreciate all of the great questions and comments that we received, including that special focus from NYU Law School on digital technology risks, which was really appreciated. So thank you again to everyone. A quick recap on some of the key issues that we covered today. I may not mention everything, but just some of the key highlights. Of course, the main framing was on discussing the approach to strengthening the risk assessment and management process, including taking a broader approach on assessing contextual risks, also taking more integrated approaches on environmental and social issues, looking more at vulnerability and disadvantaged groups, and then the pros and cons of taking more adaptive and flexible management approaches. Also highlighting there's some distinction between, firstly, the identification of the risks and then the management of the risks, which are obviously two different but linked processes. So that was one overall framing. But then we had some very specific comments and a bit of discussion ranging from climate change, then to nature and biodiversity issues, then on financial intermediaries and how we manage the risk assessment approach, looking at the portfolio level risks and the environmental and social management systems, as well as improving information disclosure with financial intermediaries, and how these strengthened approaches for risk assessment and contextual risk, how that would come in to an approach for financial intermediaries. So that was another important piece that we'll be coming back to in future consultations. Then, of course, there was the good inputs on digital technology risks. And then towards the end there, we picked up on, really the role of environmental and social commitment plans, how robust and detailed they are. And there was an example there from the ITUC, from Leo, about the World Bank's ESS2 on labor, and an example of where one of those plans only really identified the needs for labor management plans. And I guess that, Charles responded to that, but it does highlight the need that the process needs to be risk-based, but it needs to have the appropriate detail in the process to be able to set out what is required and then to track and manage that throughout the project cycle. So, of course, each project is different, but we need to make sure that this is a more robust process overall. So that's something that we're very keen to do. So that's just a quick summary. I apologize if I've missed any points, but we will be making a summary of the whole session. The next step, of course, we'll be having further consultations. For those of you interested, next week, we're running sessions focusing on how do we apply the environmental and social policies and safeguards to fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states. We'll be doing sessions focused on the Pacific next week. The following week, we'll be having sessions on climate change. And then after that, I think we're looking at country safeguard systems. But there's a whole range of other topics to go, including on gender and sexual exploitation, abuse and violence, a range of others still to come. So stay tuned for those. You can check our website for details. We're also now starting to the early stages of going from these analytical studies and consultations into drafting of policy. And we're working towards having a first draft to share publicly of the new policy by about September this year, and then further rounds of consultations after that. So yeah, we still have at least a year to go in the process. And greatly appreciating all of the consistent engagement and valuable feedback in the process. So thank you again for joining today. We'll look forward to seeing you in future consultations. And until then, stay safe. Take care. Thank you.